you have to live with intention. You have to be intentional with your time, with your decisions, with your choices. Because if you're not, then you're going to look back on your life and not like the guy in the story, but you're going to have blank spaces of regret. So I found this quote the other day that is pretty much going to be the entire basis of this entire podcast. And it might be a little short episode, but it's one that I hope, you take into consideration and you try and apply some of these principles to your own life. This is something I've been working on a lot, trying to at least. I'm really trying to focus on what we're going to be talking about today, because you never want to live a life full of regrets. You don't want to be that person who, when they get to their deathbed or whatever, or certain points of their life, you don't want to be the person who looks back and says, man, I wish I could have done this. Or, man, I could have handled that situation a little bit differently. You never want to be that person that has regrets like that. So this quote, and I'm going to butcher the name, but that's okay, because we're all learning here. But it's by someone whose name is Gerwinder Bogle, and I hope I said that right. Here's the quote. Somewhere in the near future, your older self is watching you through memories. Whether it's regret or nostalgia depends on what you do now. I'm going to say that again because it's the entire episode here. I'll go into it in a little bit. I'll explain it more. But I want to say the quote again so you can get an understanding where we're going to be talking about and where our heads are going to be at today. Somewhere in the near future, your older self is watching you through memories. Whether it's regret or nostalgia depends on what you do now. Now, I love this quote. I talk about this all the time in terms of like the memories that you want to create, right? And I want to break it down because regret versus nostalgia, I think, is a very easy way to look at the decisions that we make in our lives and how they can impact us in the future, right? I always talk about Fat Brett. Man, I wish Fat Brett could make an appearance one of these days again. But to Fat Brett's point, or whoever he is, whatever, we're going to pretend like he's someone else. Fat Brett, like I think about those times I used to have all the time. And when I say Fat Brett, let me explain, I guess, the story of Fat Brett. So when I was around, 10 years old, I just ballooned up because I was just living life. I was enjoying life. I'd play video games with my friends. I'd skateboard all the time. But I was a sucker for two things: soda and bad food. Think about any kind of food. I'm talking Taco Bell. I'd go and get the potato tacos. Boom. Those are freaking good. You put some nacho cheese on there. I'm telling you, try it. Fat Brett knows what's up in terms of food. I'll tell you another one. Cheesy gordita crunches from Taco Bell. Toss some nacho cheese on there. You got yourself a delicious meal. And I always reference the times I'd go to the gas station with my mom before school. Get a maple bar donut, baby. Get one of those bad boys. Toss in some of those twisted Fritos, and then maybe just a 32-ounce Coke, because that was me as a kid. That was my breakfast. Boom. And it sounds terrible, right? Like when I talk about this diet, when I talk about like my habits, I would just play video games every time I come home from school. Obviously, my parents, they were great. They're like, hey, you got to get your chores done. You got to study first before you can play video games. But anytime I'd come home and like get all my stuff done, I was playing games. And I love that. Like those are some of my most fond memories. And I know that sounds weird, but like my brother and I would play games for hours. We would sit there on the couch and just like chat about life, right? And the point of this whole story, the point of me talking about Fat Brett and all these things, is I look back at those memories with so much nostalgia. And I can picture in my head, I'm driving home from school on the bus, right? I'm sitting on the bus. And in my head, I'm just thinking, I can't wait to sit down and play Halo 3. I used to school kids online. Like, I had the best armor, everything. I unlocked literally everything. I was probably, I could have played in tournaments. I'm not kidding. Yeah, try me. I'm still good. Anyways, but I look back at those memories with so much fondness, and my mom's always like, "Man, I'm so sorry for making you, or like feeding you that kind of food, taking you to the gas station before school." And I'm like, "Mom, you don't understand. When I talk about this, it's because I freaking loved it." And now it's like I don't have to go back to that now because I think my body would probably shut down if I went on that diet again. But it's like those were times when I just lived life and I had so much fun doing it. And another time I look back on like my life with a lot of nostalgia rather than regret is how I train, right? I talk about training a lot with marathon training, with physical fitness, all these other things. But I always go back to the quote of, I don't know who it is actually who says this, but it's some ancient quote. So if I get it wrong, someone call me out. But it just pretty much, it goes along the lines of, I never want to be that man who never is able to see their full strength, right? Or never capable of viewing themselves in that capacity. And so the reason I train so hard is because like I don't want to regret looking back on my life and be like, man, what if I worked out harder? What if I trained my body and tried to do all these things like run marathons and do these difficult challenges, like challenge myself on physical fitness with mental capacity, like all these things. It's because I don't want to look at my life with regret. And so right now, the podcast is not necessarily in a place where it's like, it's not popping off, right? Like I'm not someone who's known in the podcast community. I'll get there. I know that's like, it just takes time. I mean, this is episode 42, so that's pretty sick. I think most podcasts stop at episode 7. And so in my head, it's just like, okay, it's just a matter of time. Like I need to keep putting in the work. I need to keep trying. But even if I don't blow up, even if I don't gain the following that I initially intended to when I started this podcast, at least I did it. Like I'll never look back on my life and be like, man, I had this message I really wanted to share, which was everyone can get after it in all aspects of life. And I fully believe in everyone's ability to challenge themselves, to put themselves out there and pursue things that they're interested in. Like I firmly believe that message. That is something that no matter what, I don't think anyone can convince me otherwise. Everyone is built to achieve greatness in life. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter your background. You can do great things. And I firmly believe that message, which is why I started this podcast. I'm not going to look back on my life and be like, man, I wish I did that. I wish I started that podcast. Because I've said it once and I'll say it 1,000 times. If this message helps one person challenge themselves and put themselves out there in a way that they initially hadn't intended to in the past, then I consider this a success. If that's just one person, I don't care who that is. Because I've talked about when I was sick and I was stuck in my bed, I couldn't watch TV. I couldn't do all these other things. So I'd listen to podcasts and that I have to attribute to getting me through that difficult time. Because it was the only thing, like I knew that if I could get through the day, if I could push myself at work and just, try and get after whatever I'm doing. And at the time it was really difficult to get through the work days just because I was insanely fatigued. I had no energy at all. My brain didn't work the way that I wanted to because I had a lot of brain fog and it was just a rough situation. But I always knew that if I got to the end of the day, I could sit down, I could put my headphones on, close my eyes for a little bit, and just listen to podcasts. Get my mind off my sickness, get my mind off the fact that I knew my body was failing me, right? It just kind of put me to ease a little bit. And it got me through. And so I'm like, oh, I'm gonna try and be that person for someone else if they're going through a similar situation. Or, like I said before, if they're thinking about something that they're nervous about attempting in life, I want to be that person that they're like, Brett said this thing, and now I'm a little bit more confident in myself. He took a risk with a podcast. Maybe I can challenge myself with dancing if that's what you want to do. But that's the main reason for the podcast. And I'm not going to look back on my life and regret that I never started it, because this is episode 42, like I said. And in my own opinion, I think they get better every time. Not trying to toot my own horn here, but it's I can see progress. I can see that the message is resonating a little bit more with other people. Some people take it, and I hear good feedback from them. I hear negative feedback from other people, and that's okay. I mean, that's part of it, right? I'm putting myself out there, and because of that, like, I'm subject to judgment on both sides, right? Good and bad. And that's okay. It's part of life. So going back to this quote, I just want to break it down a little bit. And I got thinking about time, what it's like. And I found a few things that might help illustrate the point of the entire quote a little bit. And I want to start with this parable that I found, which is called the artist's canvas. And bear with me, I'm going to read this. But in a bustling town, there was an artist renowned for creating the most realistic paintings. People would look at them and feel as if they were reliving those moments. So just picture, maybe it's a beautiful picture of a ocean. The people who go and see them, they're like, man, that is the most beautiful piece of art I've ever seen. I feel like I'm at the ocean. So that's how good this guy is. One day, a young man asked the artist how he achieved such realism. And the artist replied and said, I paint not what I see, but what I feel and have experienced. Every brushstroke captures a choice, an emotion, and a memory. And the young man, inspired, started living his life with more intention. Years later, he looked back at his life's canvas, filled with vibrant colors of joy, some shades of sorrow, but no blank spaces of regret. And the moral of this story is live with intention. Try and find ways that you can look back at your life with vibrant colors of joy, some shades of sorrow, because it's going to happen, but no blank spaces of regret. Don't regret your life. And I love what the artist said. He said, I paint not what I see, but what I feel and have experienced. Every brushstroke captures a choice, an emotion, and a memory. And there's a few things that I want to talk about in order to help you identify some of these things, help you to live a little bit more intentionally, and maybe make choices that right now might be more difficult for you, but you're going to look back on your life and be like, hey, there's no regret here. So mindful living. Everyone on social media or whatever, they talk about being more mindful, right? But what the hell does that even mean? What does mindful living mean? Pretty much it just means to practice mindfulness. Being present helps in making intentional decisions rather than reactive ones. So if you can focus on ways that you can be a little bit more proactive with your decisions, and what I mean by that is if you have something that you want to try and push yourself on or try and accomplish, you're going to have to live with a little bit more intention and like, what's going to get me to that point, right? What steps do I need to make in my life to have the outcomes that I want for whatever decision that is, right? You have to live with intention. You have to be intentional with your time, with your decisions, with your choices. Because if you're not, then you're going to look back on your life and not like the guy in the story, but you're going to have blank spaces of regret. You have to start living intentionally. Figure out what's important to you, whether that's your family, whether that's your profession, your hobbies. It doesn't matter right now. Everyone's different. Everyone's going to be in a different spot. But the point is to not let fear or judgment of other people or whatever you want to call it to stop you from doing things that you're passionate about. So be intentional with that. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is journaling. And I know I talk about this a lot on this podcast, but try to keep a daily journal. And it doesn't have to be anything too crazy. I've talked about a few ways that I journal. One, I think anyone can apply to their life, is just an end of day report. So you can just have a sheet of paper, a Google Doc, it doesn't matter. Write it in your notes app on your phone. But you can pretty much just segment your day into two basic buckets. And that could be what went well and what I wish went better. And if you put your thoughts there and think about every single day as you like go through your day, right? And you sit down at the end of it and you reflect and you're like, okay, well, what went well? And you mark it down. And then you're like, how could I improve, or what could have gone better today? That's going to give you some leeway into things that you can get better at, right? Or things that go well, like focus on those the next day and try and make the box of what went better, or like what could have gone better today. Try and get those bullet points down to maybe just 2 or 3 every single day. Some days are going to be better than others. Like I'll write down on my end of day report sometimes like 20 things that I wish went better and 3 things that went well that day. And then the next day it's the opposite, right? But my favorite quote that I've been focusing on a lot for the past 3 weeks is anything that can be measured can be improved. And the reason that's important to me is I'm training right now. So I am tracking a lot of my progress in terms of running and all these things, but I can see that as I go back and look 3 weeks ago from like my past runs to where I'm at now, they've gotten better. But it's the fact that I've been tracking it. And if you apply the same principle to your own day, and again, it doesn't have to be much, it doesn't have to take you too long. I'm seriously just talking about 5 minutes here. Reflect a little bit, but anything that's measured can be improved. Or another way that I journal is I'll pretty much just write down my thoughts for the day. Things that I noticed, or other events that happen. I think that's important too. Allie and I have this thing in our relationship where she's like, I'm really good at taking pictures and you're really good at writing. So you write down the memories that we have and I'll take pictures of them. And I, Brett, am the worst at taking pictures. So it works out great. And I just write down, things that I'm interested in. Like, I'll give you an example. I talked about running the St. George half marathon a couple weeks ago. And so in my journal that night, I was like, okay, well, here's everything that went really well on the run. And here's some things that I also noticed with like the landscape. It was incredibly beautiful. I talked about in my journal that my friend Karsten ran the race and it was his first half marathon. And it was super cool to like see his progress from, oh man, I hate running, to he just ran his first race. And so like, there's these things I want to remember later in my life that I will write down now so I can reflect on them later. Anyways, it's just kind of something that you can try. But journaling has really made that living intentionally for me a little bit easier, because I know where my head's at and I am mindful, right? I'm intentionally living. I'm trying to accomplish certain goals in my life, and journaling about them every day also helps. So the other thing that I've mentioned a few times is like 85 thoughts, right? And what that is pretty much visualizing your older self. So as an exercise, like try imagining you right now meeting your older self. What stories would you like them to share with you, right? Or what moments would make you both smile right now? And that goes back to looking at your life with nostalgia rather than regret. And so visualizing yourself as like 20 years down the road, 10 years down the road, whatever you want to do to make this a little bit easy for you so you can practice this. Just imagine what that person would say if right now you're trying to make a decision in your life. You know what you want to do, but it's a hard decision to make. And so thinking about meeting your 10 years later down the road self, would that person right now be like, I'm so glad that you did that. I'm so glad that you took the steps now to get to where we're at, because now it's like, look where you're at. Look at the progress you made. that could be something to try. Easy little exercise. One thing also with like trying to live without regrets is embracing your mistakes and learning from them. So this is another principle that I want you to try. But instead of looking at your mistakes with regret, I've talked about this before too, but frame it differently. Frame it as a lesson. And if you have some kind of mistake that you made that you're not happy about, you should write that down. You should put that in a journal, in an end of day report, or whatever you want to do. But if you're able to identify the lesson that you learned from the mistake, and just keep pushing along from there, you're probably not going to make it again. You're probably not going to make that same mistake. I would challenge you to write it down, because if you don't do that, it's going to be a little bit easier to slip into old habits or whatever you want to call it. But embracing mistakes, I think for me at least, has helped identify things that I can improve in my life. And so I don't want you to get too hung up here with like thinking about your mistakes, being like, okay, well, I know I made X, Y, and Z choices, which led me to this result. And I hate myself for that. Instead of saying that kind of stuff, be like, you know what? I did mess up here. I could have spent more time with my kids when I was at work for, an extra 2 hours. I should have been at my kids, like hanging out with my kids. Don't think of that as like, oh, man, I made a bad mistake. I'm a bad parent. Think of it as like, no, I learned a lesson here. And instead of focusing so much on work, I'm going to spend more time with my kids, which again goes back to that mindful living and living with intention. You got to figure out what's important to you, because your decisions will change once you identify that. So don't look at your mistakes as failures. Look at them as lessons. Write them down, document them, so you don't do it again. The other thing I want to talk about is setting clear intentions for yourself. So mindful living, this all ties back into that. But before making any decisions, especially significant ones, you need to ask yourself, how will my future self perceive this? Or you could say, how is this going to benefit my family or myself down the road? A good example that I think of this all the time, because I struggle with this, is like I'll try and find the easy route. And what I mean by that is like the things that I know I want to do. Like I love to read, but it does take time and it's hard sometimes. Like after a long day of work, it's so much easier just to jump on TikTok and mindfully or mindlessly scroll, right? Or mindlessly like go down a couple rabbit holes, right? Like you can find yourself making some of those decisions all the time. And that's not a bad thing. Like if you need to decompress, do it. But for me, it's like I'd much rather read, gain some knowledge. And I know that's a harder thing. But since my future self will probably be like, hey, thanks for reading that book. Not being on TikTok. Anyways. But you need to be intentional. You need to set clear intentions for yourself. So what I would say here is just like spend time asking yourself those kind of questions. What's important to me? What do I want to accomplish? How can I accomplish that? What steps do I need to take to get there? And then once you have that, it'll make those decisions, like I said, especially significant ones, a little bit easier to make. So yeah, those are just a few principles that I would say are crucial if you want to try and live with a little bit more intention, a little bit more mindfulness, and then have that ability to not look at your life with some regret. And as I was prepping for this podcast, I thought of time almost as like a river, right? Because it never stops flowing and we create ripples all the time with every decision that we make. And so because it never stops, you got to keep that in mind. Time never stops. It never slows down. It's always going to flow. It's always going to keep going. But we can make ripples in that time, either good or bad choices that we will look back on and be like, man, that was fun. Or I wish I did this. So think of it as a river. Like time's not going to slow down. It's the only thing in life that always keeps going. Doesn't matter. The other thing is, time will always keep going, but we're humans and we're all going to die. eventually at some point. That'll be a big ripple, but that also helps you live like with intention because you know you're going to die. Don't get hung up on the small things in life. Steve Jobs has a great quote on that. I don't remember what it is, so I'm not going to try and quote it, but pretty much his entire thing is like the same deal. Like, time is going to end up, so don't live someone else's life. Like, live your own. That's pretty much his whole entire principle with that one. So that's what I would say is like, if you think about life in terms of like you're going to die, then you realize that the small things that you're focused on don't necessarily matter as much as you thought they did. Again, kind of morbid, but happens. I read this thing on LinkedIn and it was a self-help thing, but I think the principle is important. And this post was talking about the power of now, pretty much how every moment is an opportunity and you need to take action now. Every moment's an opportunity. This podcast today is a good example. Like, I didn't want to record. I'm pretty tired. I don't feel the best. Again, it goes back to the reason why I'm doing it. It's because I want to be that person for someone who might need it. Or I like to think of it as like, what are lessons that I wish Fat Brett knew that going into life, make it a little bit easier to make decisions. And so because that's what's driving me, that idea of I need to create this almost this podcast as like a time for me to reflect or like advice I wish I knew when I was younger, then that drives me more than being a little bit more tired or being sick or not, feeling the best, not feeling up to it. But I think it's more important to try those things than it is to focus on how you're feeling, right? So the power now, I'm sitting there and I'm like, I'm just going to do it right now. I'm going to go take a shower. I just ran. I'm going to take a shower and then I'm going to sit down, prep a little bit more and just record because the message is more important to me. But it's making that decision like in the now, right? So think about that. Will Smith also has this quote that I thought was interesting. It's more of like how to live a good life, but I like what he says. Will Smith said, if you're not making someone else's life better, then you're wasting your time. Your life will become better by making other lives better. So that's a good reason to like sit down and do a podcast. If I can make someone's life better, then hey, again, this is a success for me and I'm not going to ever regret about it. But those are just a few things that I wanted to talk about today because it is important to live intentionally. It's important to figure out what drives you in life and then focus on those things until you get there. And then once you do, you'll be able to look back on the moments where you're struggling or you're grinding or you're sleeping under your desk because maybe you're starting a business. You're going to be able to look back at those really difficult moments in your life with nostalgia rather than regret. I've never heard someone say that they regretted putting in extra effort. Effort is always rewarded. And no matter what you're doing in life, if you're putting forth a valiant effort, if you're actually trying, your life's going to increase in terms of happiness. You're going to feel more productive. You're going to accomplish more. You're going to be the person that you initially thought you were going to be when you were growing up. What did you want to do when you were growing up? And how can you get there now? My challenge to everyone is just focus on ways that you can be a little bit more intentional with your decisions, intentional with how you live, and don't let fear or the judgment of other people stop you from trying to accomplish your goals. Live intentionally and always focus on what your future self would tell you to do. It might be scary, but the reward will be a lot better. And I have enough evidence in my life to fully believe in that principle. So I know it'll work for you. I appreciate everyone for listening to this podcast. Like I mentioned, it's probably a little bit shorter of an episode, but that's okay. I think, it's just little snippets here and there. But if there's any topics you want me to cover, or if you have any questions that you think I can give some insight on, by all means, send them my way. But until that point, keep getting after it, everyone. Proud of you guys. Get some.